Okay, perfect. So hello, everybody. I would like to introduce Steph Bloom to you all this evening, who's going to very kindly do the talk on horse, saddle, rider, the holistic approach. I first sort of made contact with Steph probably about 3 years ago coming up, when I was really interested in a Facebook post that she put up doing the rider assessment. That was the first time that I'd ever come across the riders being fitted to the saddle on one side and the horse being fitted to the saddle on the other side. So contacted Steph, and eventually a few months later went over to London, met up with Steph and Maria, and then Steph came over to me in the earlier part of the following year. And Steph comes over about 3 or 4 times a year over to Northern Ireland, either with the new saddles for clients or to do the saddle fittings on previously purchased saddles. And really I found Steph's method of the saddle fit and the rider assessment, she's meticulous in her fitting, and it really isn't about just plonking any old saddle on any old back. And Steph has really highlighted to me how important it is to have the horse in as best a shape as possible to carry the saddle and to carry us. And I'm sure everybody's going to learn something new about saddle fitting this evening. And it's about the horse side this time, and hopefully then after a summer break in the autumn, we're going to do another one then on the rider fit to the saddle, which again I think everybody will find really, really interesting as well. So over to you, Steph.
So all I want to say about Kissing Spines is that you know, we're still sitting here, aren't we, in best practice? What's our best understanding of things at the moment? My best understanding of it is that it is postural, that it's particularly a lack of push up in the thoracic sling, so that the spine, where it sits slightly concave, slightly, and have to remember, extension behind the wither, that it's actually bringing the shoulders up that will open that up. It's not forcing the back up. It's not the core. It's not, you know, engaging the heave line. And so basically for a Kissing Spines horse, all of this applies. All of the normal saddle fitting rules apply. We perhaps need to be even more careful, but we need to provide the horse with something that they can push up through the thoracic sling. They can lift the rider, carry the rider easily, and open up those spaces between the spinal processes. So really, I don't see fitting the Kissing Spines horses any different. Happy to answer any questions at the end, if anybody would like me to give them my take on anything more. So there we have front plate, just my website on there, and very pleased to be here. Really glad Lisa set this group up, and it's been fabulous working with her in Northern Ireland. I have to say that the rider fit saddles that I do work so well for her customers because of Lisa's work with them. So big up Lisa as well, and what a huge contribution she's made to the saddles working. So if I could have the next slide, just a little bit about me. This will all be on replay, so if anyone wants to pick up details from these slides, I could possibly even send you a version of the files, so just let me know if you'd like it. So yeah, it's the last 3 years I've been involved in the rider fit, but I've been a saddle fitter for 15 years with a specialism in wider horses and ponies, the tricky ones. So I've always had the challenging fits, so it's no different that I now am dealing with riders with issues and lots of remedial fits for horses. So next slide, we'll start on the meat of it. And I need to remember to change it on mine, so I've got my notes in front of me. So the photos hopefully will be vaguely informative. They're not the biggest photos. I hope you're all able to see them on the screen size that you've got. And I want to talk about saddle fitting. This is based on a presentation I did to the RDA coaches last year. I fit for the Chief Princess Anne coach, I think it is. Karen Thompson, who's fabulous. We did a demo, a presentation for them last year. So this was aimed at professionals. I've tweaked it a little bit. So this is a hands up question. It works better in person, but you can put your hands up, I believe, on Zoom. I'm not sure I'll be able to see them, but how many people find some saddles uncomfortable or struggle to be effective in them? Have you got pain? Have you got significant asymmetry? You know, I think some discomfort or struggling to be effective, the asymmetry bit, even if you don't have pain, I think that's really common. And it's obviously something I address. And it's important to the horse. We'll cover that. We will be covering it in great detail, though, hopefully in the next talk. How many are completely confused by all the saddle fitting information out there? Whether it is actually education, or whether it's marketing, perhaps masking itself as education, because qualifications, education, and saddle fitting is a tricky thing. I've got a blog post on it for anybody that's interested, who fit over to my website, though not until I'm done. Who feels that they can no longer judge when a saddle looks right from photos? You know, I've got a really strong belief that we see so many appallingly placed saddles, saddles out of balance, that it makes it very, very difficult to actually know what you're looking at. So I encourage all of my customers to use their senses, all of them, touch, sight, I suppose sound and so on isn't quite so applicable. But think about what the horse is going to feel. I think it can be really scary looking at saddles. And if you start getting into the mindset of what is the horse feeling when they're trying to lift the rider? So don't just think about the horse moving along. If the horse wants to push up under the saddle, where are going to be the pressure points? Where's the rider going to be carried? When we look at rider issues, again, it's more logical than you think. Don't panic. Start thinking about support. Where do you need support? Where do you feel unsupported? It is subtle, and we can't address the needs of all riders, particularly with more significant physical disability, without customized saddles, but we can do a lot by getting the basic fit right for the rider. So I'm going to look at adjustments for the saddle and the horse next, adjustments to the saddle and the rider before moving on to new directions. But this saddle fit, the look and feel, is really important. I hope we can just help you develop your eye a little bit and your confidence. Can I have the next slide, please? So we've got a couple of definitions of what saddle fitting is here. Again, you can come back to these, but it's to emphasize that this is a really, really tricky profession. We get tarred with all sorts of brushes. It's physically a very challenging job with two sentient beings, only one of whom can communicate to us, and then an inanimate object in the middle with myriad designs, myriad ways to build saddles, myriad ways to fit saddles because of it. So the saddle fit is parachuted into your situation and has to deal with all of this in one go. And that might explain why my new saddle fit appointments are 3 hours long. So now I need to change my slide as well. So the first thing I'm going to look at as I arrive for a saddle fitting is looking at the horse. And Lisa's already mentioned that I've kind of really emphasized to her and all of her customers the importance of how the horse moves. I've seen saddles that are bouncing all over the place when the horse is not warmed up, or the rider isn't sitting right and the rider isn't asking the right questions. And either after a warm up, like with a normal situation, where you've got your saddle, it's an ongoing situation. So 10 minutes later, your saddle might sit better than it did in the beginning, straighter. It may not lift at the back. Once the horse has lifted its back. So the horse influences the saddle through soundness. And I always look at soundness as a real sort of sliding scale. We've got the things that I look at postural right at the beginning, which are the early warning signs that there could be lameness down the road, in my opinion. Straightness is part of soundness, and it is part of that compensation movement pattern. If your horse isn't straight, it's likely compensating for issues in its body, that it's not able to push up in front. That's a common reason for not being straight, and not able to break behind. That may not be something you've heard talked about much, but it's given me my best understanding of how a horse moves. We have, what paradigms are we looking at? If we're looking at the paradigm, i.e. the example of what we think is best practice, So looking at how the horse moves, if we're looking at what wins in the arena, is that actually the paradigm we want to follow? So I'm really keen on looking at horses whose backs are truly up. There have been lots of photos shared recently of backs dropped behind the saddle. I shared one, I think yesterday. I'm looking at the back being lifted throughout, not jammed up, but being lifted from the front. And with the horse, we also have other inputs and factors. So I'm having to look at hoof balance, hoof function. How is that setting the horse up for success or not? Proprioceptive inputs. The equine documentalist did a superb webinar over lockdown about all the time that your horse spends when you're not riding it, and how does that affect posture. So it's incredibly complex. With the rider, we won't dwell on it too much, but I'm looking at their straightness, at their skill and ability. That is not with any judgment, but it's just trying to come up with the best possible solution for them. What is their size? And that's not just what's your hip measurement, what's your weight, what's your height, what's your femur length. But for me, it's also the size of the pelvis, which gets really exciting. But yeah, we'll touch on that more when we do our next talk. What's the intent of the rider? So what's their discipline? What's their stage of training? How often do they want to ride? I mean, this is unending. And then we move on to the saddle. So if I could have the next slide, please. And this is just a really brief slide. I hope the pictures helps to start to get your eye in. We've got a before, which is bottom left. Now that saddle perhaps doesn't look particularly awful, but it did not work on that horse. And this came from my colleague in Canada, Erica Allen. Does the horse look as if it could have grown the saddle? Which I just think is brilliant. It will work more for some designs of saddles than others. But does it look sensible on the horse? Does it look like it could sit in the right place? Or is there something just throwing your eye? You can't decide what it is. I wouldn't expect you to, but does it look off? Because hopefully you can see that the 3 saddles with riders on board are all looking pretty good. They all look like they're sitting nicely around the horse. So it's just something you can have as your first question. Does it look as if the horse could have grown the saddle itself? Could I have the next slide, please? I'm beginning to feel like Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty. Right, the placement of the saddle, yay, critical, absolutely critical. And if you're ever asking for help from photos, just as critical. So this is where I wonder about the photos that we see everywhere. How common are photos like the one in the bottom left? That was a before photo that's sent to me. I can't remember now who sent it, but it, you know, we see lots and lots of photos like that. Saddles are not in the right place, and they can't possibly fit where it's not supposed to be. So can you find the very back of your horse's shoulder blade? I would recommend all of you who haven't done this before to go out tomorrow and don't prod around like poking on the back of the shoulder blade. I want you to go to where you know the shoulder blade is, and I want you to palpate it really firmly. Sound like a school teacher now, sorry. And then I want you to palpate going backwards. So if you look at that photo with the color, the top left, you'll be, 6 inches forwards of that blue line, and you'll palpate backwards until your fingers finally literally fall off the back of the shoulder blade. Now, with some horses, it's clearer than others, but you are looking for softness there. It's not a muddy, decision. It's not a muddy area. You should find a clear drop off at the back, and it will be a lot softer. That is the back of the shoulder blade. Can you find the back rib? That's a really useful thing to be able to do as well. And again, go down to the flank. So in front of the parting where the hair changes direction on the flank, come forwards and find the back rib level with almost the bottom of the saddle flap. That's where you need to go down to and track it up. Again, palpate firmly. The rib will disappear under the long back muscle. And then you look at where it interacts with the saddle, where the weight-bearing area is. Different panel designs have different weight-bearing areas, so there's no definitive on that. and you've got different schools of saddle fitting thought. So you'll read, always place the saddle 2 to 3 fingers behind the shoulder blade. Now that's true of most saddles, and most British saddles are designed on a panel that extends to the very front and the very back of the saddle. So it's designed to spread weight. For those saddles, they've got to be significantly, properly within the back rib where the weight bearing area is, and the saddle needs to be behind the shoulder. It's the tree points. If you don't know how to find the tree points on your saddle, I can show you. I'm presuming everybody can see me, because obviously I can't see me at the moment. So, and I've just thought this is a flipping mono flap, isn't it? So that's not going to be so helpful. Let me get a traditional saddle. Something occurred to me, this might be useful. And because I can't see anything, I hope you can see this. It's Velcro as well, unfortunately. But if I press through here, can you, Lisa, is that okay? Can everybody see that? So if I press through here, that's soft. And there's actually a line of stitching here. So on many traditional saddles that aren't mono flaps, especially, that is the tree point. It's hard. Hopefully you can hear that. That's not. So find the tree points, get them behind the shoulder blade, unless you know that your saddle is specifically not designed to have to go that far back. Complicated. But placement is essential. So please, if you only take one thing away from this talk, make sure your saddle's in the right place. It's fundamental. And so many people get it wrong. They don't realize how far back the shoulder blade is. Okay, can we go? Yeah, forwards one. So this is all to help you develop your eye and judge. I guess it's about maybe judging saddle fitters, maybe, having more confidence to know whether something's right. So I'm just trying to give you as many pointers as you can to help you judge saddle fit. So saddle must be correctly placed before we can judge saddle balance. Now you notice I haven't got into width, tree angle, because there are so many different ways of fitting the width at the front. So I'm trying to get into more overall things that can help you work out when you might need to call the saddle fitter, when things are correct, when they're not. So I guess that's the main aim of this. Do we have a tree that's too wide or too narrow? And there are several aspects to that. And you'll find different organizations use the word width differently. So in English saddles, hello, Nunu. Glad she's joined us. There are certain companies that talk about width, and they mean pommel width. They almost mean the width of the saddle across the top of the horse. But in England, where it's the seat of most saddle fitting training in the UK, and forgive me saying England, but it's Walsall, and it's all of that. It's the Society of Master Saddlers. So width is angle. So it's the tree angle. And most trees can either be widened or narrowed, not all, or they obviously have the changeable head plates, which I don't work with. So I'm talking more about wooden trees, but they all have the same fundamentals. So what affects saddle balance? The too wide or the too narrow tree does, and you're probably aware of this on the basics. So too wide, it will sit probably too low in front. Too narrow, probably be too high in front. But there are other aspects as well. How wide is the pommel? Does it suit your horse's wither shape? How wide are the rails? Now, has anybody ever talked to you about that? Rail angle as well. So there's how far apart they're set and what angle they are on the horse's back. So we got two aspects to the rails, and then we've got the two aspects at the front. So angle and pommel width, and then rail width as well. That rail width is critical. All saddles carry the rider over the rails, and that is where the horse has to push up the most. We try to sit the rider as close to the base of the wither as possible so they can lift you. And this is where we can reference kissing spines, because if those rails are curving in or just a narrow, normally to be narrow, they have to have quite a curve on them. And so if they are coming in, they're not going to be wide enough for the spine. And although the tree is not touching your horse, there really should be room for the spinal processes there. So that applies to every horse. I like a wider rail. I like a flatter rail on average. And it is something that I can show my customers a little bit how to check. Lisa's been through a bit of that. And your saddle fitter may well be able to show you how to check that area. But I believe that not all saddle fitters actually look at it. Then we move on to panel and flocking depth. Yeah, was there a question?
Yeah, I'm not understanding what you mean by rail, the rail. I'm not understanding.
Okay, and I realise I should have had a tree up here with me. What I will do is I will show you the underside of this saddle.
Yeah.
Now, can you see all the way to the bottom?
Yeah.
I don't know how much you can see. So the rails are in here. So that's a rail and that's a rail over that side. So these are part of the structure of the tree. They are solid. They are, in this saddle, they are wooden. And that is, you can imagine with that rigid part of the saddle being over the part where we want the horse to push up, they need to be the right shape.
Okay.
Does that explain the basics of it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming back.
Plastic trees don't have rails, but they do have a little bit of that going on. We still need it to be pretty much the right shape through there. Yeah, panel and flocking depth. So some panels are built to be quite spacious and take a lot of flocking. So if your saddle's too high in front, if it's out of balance, then it could be flocking. Don't assume that a saddle that's tipping back or that looks really high in front is too narrow, because a ton of flocking in there is going to make it tip back. While we're on this, I will say there is no magic amount of clearance over the wither. So don't obsess about how much there should be for any, for all saddles. You will have the right amount of clearance for your saddle on your horse. And it might be different if you own more than one saddle, even on the same horse, because your dressage saddle might have a higher pommel, so you'll have more clearance. It will settle with the rider on, so we have to take that into account. But panel and flocking depth will change the saddle balance hugely. But if you can monitor the saddle balance, then again, you'll have a better idea of when to call the saddle fitter out. And the biggest problem in the industry is this routine of having the saddle checked. So yes, there are still issues of fitting saddles, selling saddles as well. But it's this interaction between customer and saddle fitter, and your responsibility and the saddle fitter's responsibility. And I try and show my customers some of these basics. This saddle balance. Take a photo of your saddle when your fitter's been, stand back, include the feet, include head and neck and tail, and take a photo of the saddle girthed up. So you have it on your phone and you can reference it, and that will show you A, where to place your saddle, and B, if you take it after you've ridden and the saddle's fully bedded in with the girth tight, so just after you get off, and I don't mean super tight, I mean, as tight as you would have it, that's an incredibly useful reference. And you can start to develop your eye for the relationship between pommel and cantle, which is what we're talking about with saddle balance. You'll see several examples here. And top right is one of the most interesting ones. I'm just going to go to the very last bit, which is flap angle. If that saddle was put in balance, i.e. bring the red line to the horizontal, that flap is going to be pointing backwards, which is obviously nonsense because it gives nowhere for the knee to sit. Some showing saddles are built out of balance just to make it look neater, so the back is lower. And it's just so wrong. The tree cannot do its job. It cannot spread weight. So tree shape comes into all of this. The tree shape might be wrong for the horse. If you're looking at a saddle, you don't know whether it fits or not. The tree shape might be wrong. It might have, a really high pommel. It might be, there are two-piece and one-piece trees. There's so many different things to tree shape, but that plays a part in saddle balance. And as I say, flap angle is something you can use as a visual. If you start looking at somebody's saddle and the flap is pushing backwards, you've got a problem. Top left, I thought it was a really good photo. It's Ulla Salzgeber on Rusty many years ago, and he's in Piaf, which is the most elevated pace, which means he is higher in front than normal, lower in the back than normal. And does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what the balance of the saddle is? Is it high in front, like he is, or is it low in front? Hopefully you can see that Ulla's being tipped forwards. She's resisting it, but her lower leg is going back. Her thigh is almost vertical. And obviously the green line that I've drawn is pretty much aligning her shoulder, hip, heel. I mean, her shoulders have come back a little bit because she is compensating. But take into account the balance of the horse in front of you. Many, many horses show the opposite balance. And if the saddle looks too low in front, is it really possible to have a saddle imbalance on a horse whose rib cage is really, really dipping in front? A little bit of food for thought that maybe we should be working on the horse so their rib cage isn't tipping forwards. And bottom left, that shows the lowest part of the saddle. If you start to think about where that places the rider, it starts to bring the leg almost off the back of the flap, the whole of the leg, the thigh, not just, you know, the calf starting to come back underneath, not just the top of the thigh, but everything is shifted back. And if we move that green line an inch, 2 inches further forwards, because the saddle comes into better balance, that is too high in front, that saddle, then it will be in better balance. But it's got a strange flap because, again, I lower the front of that saddle, the back edge of the flap is going to really, really point backwards. So it's a slightly strange design, but most flaps at the back are vertical. Really look at your saddle, notice these things, get your eye in. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So slippage. Fitting wide horses and ponies, people sort of assume that on these round rib cages, saddles will slide. But actually, if you get it right, they don't. However, can depend on the type of saddle fitting. So the traditional saddles I fit AH are designed for a broad panel area. They're designed for intrinsic stability. And they have 4 girth straps. They're set up to deal with all of this stuff. But some of the some other saddles will not have that level of intrinsic stability in them. And the other brand that I fit, Ergo X2, does not. It relies on horse and rider being, I would say, on the path to straightness. None of us are ever perfectly straight. When we start to really analyze why a saddle might be slipping, we can look at various factors. You know, it may happen with some riders and not others if there are more than one rider rides a horse. So to that end, we're probably going to look at correcting the rider. If your saddle starts to slip, your horse has probably changed shape. And we are probably seeing an asymmetric muscle pattern, asymmetric skeleton. So, you know, the skeleton gets pulled out of alignment. I'm sure you know that the horse doesn't have a collarbone connecting shoulder blades with the rib cage, with the spine and the rib cage. So anything that's off, then the horse can really, really throw the rib cage. And I look a lot at rotation of the rib cage. If you look at both of those photos, you will see horses that are significantly rotated. And the top photos from Ergo X2 in Sweden, where Charlotte Desjardins is sitting on the horse on the left, and the owner is sitting on the horse on the right. So very able riders, and this is something, whatever you think of the way that Charlotte rides, I know there's lots of opinions, she can de-rotate a horse's rib cage like nobody else. And it stops the saddle slipping, which helps the horse, obviously. So when it does come to slippage, we've got to look at why is it slipping. There is no magic formula of going, your saddle's slipping to the right, so do this. We need to look at the basic fit. And if you're ever sending photos to somebody who's helping you, saddle fitter or somebody knowledgeable, that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for a photo from the back to show how much it slipped. We want to start addressing the whole fit. We will look at hair movement. There almost certainly will be hair movement with slippage. Where is it? What type of hair movement? And as I say, there are many causes of saddle slippage. We need to work out how the saddle has changed in terms of its fit, because the horse has changed. And we need to look at changes in the horse and changes in the rider, because often as not, saddle slippage is an early sign of lameness. It is that compensatory movement pattern showing up perhaps early on. And, you know, it can show up really early when vets really can't find anything because it's just not at a clinical level. I should emphasize as well that stability can be achieved in the wrong way. A stable saddle doesn't mean it fits. So it's very easy to say a saddle that slips can't possibly fit. And it can be very easy to say that a saddle that's stable does fit, but I'm afraid neither are completely true. So I'm sorry if I'm not stopping this being smoke and mirrors, because I know a lot of people feel that it is smoke and mirrors. It's not. It's just you need to take everything into account. Can I have the next slide, please? So I addressed this at the beginning, and this is your role as a rider, as an owner, as a trainer, maybe. I think the more you can learn about how saddles should look and should feel to the horse, the more you will help yourself and your horse. So, you know, when we're trying to get to the bottom of things, if we can work out what the horse is feeling, it's going to give us more clues. So your saddle fitter should be able to show you how to run your hands under the saddles, check some basics. But one thing you certainly can do is flip the saddle over and have a look at the panels. Feel them firmly. Again, I will show you. If I'm feeling them, don't so much do that, but I will put this much pressure on a saddle. We're trying to replicate a rider being on board. So little tiny irregularities, if they're kind of just a bit soft, a bit firmer, not a hard knot, then that's kind of inconsequential. We need to feel them firmly and not, you see lots of people just sort of stroke them. It's leather and it's flocking and it's not going to feel completely smooth. But if you look at the photo of the saddle upside down, the panels, that's a storage problem. So look at your saddle, look at the panels. What are you putting on your horse? Does it have a pretty smooth surface? Are you putting something that's appropriate on the horse? Is the channel wide enough? That's really easy to check. You can check spinal width quite easily as well. And it just needs to be wide enough to accommodate the width of the spinal processes. There are different schools of thought in it. Again, you know, there's no one answer to all of this, but certainly the way most people fit, that just needs to be wide enough. These are all things that you can look at and start to judge for yourself. The saddle bottom left, probably an old Steuben. I certainly can't see the label on it, but it's overflocked and the channel is really narrow. So I'm sure your gut instinct is looking at it going, there's something off with that. Really press those panels. Is there any give in them? You know, you're going to be putting your 10 stone, your 12 stone, your 14 stone on top of them. So do you want that to be absolutely solid? Do you want it to be a thin foam? You know, there are foam rubber panels out there on show saddles that are about 1 centimetre thick, maybe 2 centimetres. That's not what I'd want to be putting on my horse's back. Have your saddle fitter show you how to feel down the front of the saddle. You've probably all seen the classic, and hopefully you can vaguely see this. You know, hand on the pommel, run your hand down the front of the saddle. How does it fit down there? That's the one just to check the contact at the front. But compared to the English traditional saddle I was showing you first, which I will show you the front with gussets, and it's probably identical to the model on the chestnut. So a front gussets, and we've got a rear gusset. These are the extra pieces of leather. This must have a really nice feel down the front because we have contact all the way to the front, and the scapula will come just a little under the panel of any slightly forward cut saddle. So unless you've got a flat showing saddle or a dressage saddle, that needs to be a really nice fit because it's got the scapula coming back underneath it. Then we've got a completely different ball game, totally different panel structure, and this actually carries very little weight. So on this saddle, how it feels at the front is not half as important. This is an Ergo X2, and it has a different shape at the back. So we're not expecting to see that in really close contact with the horse all the way back. If there's a little bit of a gap at the back, that might be absolutely fine and normal for this saddle on that horse. And when the rider gets on board, that gap just closes. But it is a completely different shaped panel designed to relieve the thoracolumbar area. So they are fitted very differently. So where should the contact be on your saddle? You need to know that. You need to chat to your saddle fitter. And contact is related to pressure. Are there any areas of excess pressure? If you're feeling, gaps in one place and more contact in another, that gap is going to mean that your weight is borne in other areas. So the top left photo, the coat movement, that's a lack of contact. So you can see it's been scrubbed, and that's pretty much under where the rider's sitting. And we call that 4-point pressure because you're going to have pressure at the front, pressure at the back, and not enough pressure in the middle. And your horse is never going to be comfortable to push up into it. So we've got an awful lot of clues here. We've got things that the layman can look at and start to work out what might be going on. Start to look at, is it affecting how the horse carries itself? Is how the horse carries itself affecting the saddle fit? Because they affect each other. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. I'm going to talk about adapting the fit. So the photo with the scissors, I joke regularly that I'm more like a Blue Peter presenter sometimes, for those of you in the UK, than I am a saddle fitter, because it is really useful to be able to adapt saddles to horses and riders, though we won't get too much into that. So I know that many people believe that a well-fitting saddle shouldn't need anything other than maybe a thin numbner to keep it clean. In my opinion, that's a really old-fashioned point of view. And as in 99% of cases with horses, the answer is it depends. There are so few hard and fast rules. So does your horse need a little bit more cushioning because they've got no muscle? Many do. And you'll see I've got a picture there of a Mattis correction pad where you can put shims into pockets. And I use sheepskin quite a lot. It's very useful for leisure horses. It absorbs shock in walk and trot really well. Not there's a lot of shock in walk, but it gives that soft tissue expansion space a lot of body workers talk about. It wicks sweat, so that's fabulous. It's a really good product, but it doesn't do everything. We need to understand materials when we're looking at saddle pads. It bottoms out in canter, which is quite interesting when show jumpers, tend to like sheepskin half pads under their saddles, but it can't absorb the shock at canter. So it certainly can't absorb the shock going over a fence or landing after a fence. But we need to take the thickness of our pad into account. We need to choose it wisely, choose materials wisely. And I hope that we'll get better at understanding materials, understanding what each horse needs under each saddle, and for each discipline, what are the forces involved? And ultimately, everything we do with saddles is about trying to mitigate the forces acting on the horse and try and make them favorable. So there are some amazing pads out there. D3O is a fantastic product, and it's the performance layer in it was in the Invictus pad. I need to try and find another source of it, but it's like a non-Newtonian fluid. If you've ever done corn flour and water, if your kids have ever done it, if you knock it, it's hard because you're rapidly putting energy in and the bonds between the molecules lock up. So you can understand how a saddle pad that does that and yet has some softness, if you push a thumb into corn flour and water, and that's corn starch in the States, if you push your thumb down into it, it feels soft. So there are some really clever things out there. So I'm a big fan of the right pad under the right saddle. Even a thin numbner needs to have a nice little layer of felt in it. I like a pad that can stand up on its own. Then we have shim pads. The Mattis pad takes shims in the front and the back. There are lots of options for those. I like the subtle ones. We have lots of thin shims and you can contour them. So you're not just going, do I want thick or thin? And ending up with these sort of rectangles under the saddle. We would never do that with the flocking. We'd never have an edge on the flocking. So we want to contour our shims as well. Girthing and girth. Again, these saddles are very different. The AH saddles have got 4 girth straps, even on dressage saddles. Your choice of girth straps matter. Don't go changing them willy-nilly. Check with your fitter and understand which one you need to use and why. And if I have a girthing information sheet, but a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I only share it with a few customers. But you can have a huge difference between going on the first strap, the point strap, and the third, say, and then going to the second and the fourth. They are very, very different. And I've had somebody lame a horse through using 2 and 4 instead of 1 and 3 for quite a period of time. And selection of girth, again, don't believe too much hype. Some of the research that's been done out there that's publicly available on pretty much a girth design, there were 10 elite horses and riders used for that study. So can we extrapolate it? Can we apply the same learning to a big round cob where I would fit an elasticated girth and they say that their research shows don't ever use elastic? I disagree with how far they take that research and how far they apply it to other people. Breastplates and croppers will affect the fit of your saddle. I'm not a fan of croppers. Breechings for full-on endurance maybe. Breastplates can sometimes be essential, but the right selection of girth straps can sometimes negate the need for a breastplate overall, but you know, big cross-country tracks or whatever. Beware of breastplates pulling saddles forwards. Sometimes people talk about breastplates adding stability to a saddle that's a little bit roly-poly. I wouldn't want to use that. I want to address the fit. You know, whenever something's not feeling stable, let's look at the fundamental fit. Bottom left is the Invictus pad I was talking about. They are on a hiatus at the moment. Sadly, the owner of the company died, and it's in probate, which is really sad because it's an amazing product. And it is a shin pad, that version. So for the rider, we can actually do a huge amount as well, but that really is the newer area. That's not something that an awful lot of saddle fitters get into. And I am looking at support for the rider. We're not looking at support for the horse because it's on top of the horse. We're looking at mitigation for the horse. But support for the rider can be transformative. And that's what Lisa's seen with this different approach to saddle fitting, starting with the actual shape of the pelvis. If the rider can be stabilized in the saddle, and we don't see that many truly stable riders these days, not as many as we used to. So a lot of the time the saddles are not working for them. It's all very well to talk about biomechanics and to go for biomechanics training. I'm a great fan of it, as you can tell by my working relationship with Lisa. But so often a biomechanics session or 3 or 4 is simply helping you deal with a saddle that is not helping you. In other sports, and I don't always think of horse riding as a sport because I do really believe in a lot of these classical approaches with pushing up in front and so on. So I don't see it only as a sport, but in other sports, we have customized gear that helps us partake in the sport, you know, better to achieve more. And that's what we really need to be looking at with saddles in equestrianism, because they're letting us down. And so often you see riders at the top level, they're in sponsored saddles and they're not doing them any good whatsoever. So it's not just the horse we need to consider on this. Stability is all. I'll mention seat savers because, yeah, adding a bit of cushioning can improve things. You know, some people want to order extra foam in the seat of their saddle. But if the seat of the saddle fits your pelvis, you shouldn't need any of this. It's not a perfect world. So they can work, but be aware of downsides. They can mark the saddle, you know, the gel in ones, the Cavallo ones. They have attachments that dent panels. They lift you away from the horse. There is one coming out. I hope it comes out soon. I know the guys in Scotland actually who are trying to develop it. I hope they are able to get it out soon. It's going to be a shimmable seat saver for the rider, which will be really exciting. So watch out for that one. And if I can have the next slide, please. So this is, I kind of touched on this all the way through, and this is where I want to take you from what was, I understand, not a thorough versing in how a saddle should fit and tree angles and all of that, because there are different schools of thought. I'm trying to talk to you about more about your saddle and how to understand better how your saddle fits and how to look at photos, how to judge saddle fit. We're all trying to get better at looking at photos of how horses are moving if you're at all interested in posture. So developing your eye, I think, is really important. like we should know what a good hoof looks like, know what a saddle looks like that probably fits well. I will say that you cannot say that a saddle fits perfectly from photos unless you've had your hands on it, you probably fitted it yourself. We can assess when the saddle doesn't fit from photos. So physical forces I mentioned, it's not talked about. We don't talk about centrifugal force on corners. We don't talk about all this stuff, the impact that we have on the horse. Rebound from the saddle, can we deaden the rebound to stop us perhaps having rotational falls, being catapulted out of the saddle? But mostly, can we help horse and rider absorb physical forces with less harm, ideally with no harm? Rider assessments, I hope, will become more standard. I would really like to see them rolled out across the industry, particularly where people run into problems. You can see, it might even be a picture of Lisa there. It's certainly one of her jackets with the turquoise on it. So these stripy jackets are really useful. We use them in the rider assessments, and we can look at your functionality, your symmetry, and your pelvic shape, and what you need to stabilize you. So pelvic shape I'll touch on very briefly. Male and female pelvises are not that different. So when we're looking at the research that bike companies have done and that Maria Hallring of Ergo X2 in Sweden had done, they show that, you know, if you look at the statistical distribution with kind of 14 centimeters wide for seat bones down to 4, that's the main, I mean, that's quite a big range. You know, the distribution is like that. The overlap between men and women is massive. The difference is small. So don't go thinking there are male and female saddles. Marketing. I find that everybody's different. Everybody needs something slightly different. What I do find is quite common is short, wide pelvises. And if we're looking at a stable base of support, a short, wide pelvises, wide seat bones, wide pubic arch, which I've got, you're going to struggle to be stable front to back. You might be slightly more stable side to side, but not much, because if you can't stabilize on your pubic arch, and I do believe that we should be putting some weight on our pubic arch, the only way we can get our thighs rotated in. Having that stable base of support benefits the horse hugely. We will talk about the rider, we'll talk about the effect on the horse at the next talk, but we need to address that in our saddle fitting. So we have lots of interesting saddles come through all the time for the horse. I think there are some two-part saddles that look really fascinating that will help the horse. There are these round panels that the Ergo X2 is that perhaps free up the shoulder and the thoracolumbar. So there are always developments around the basic design of saddles, but there are some quite fundamental ones as well. These two-part saddles, a company called Ipotane, who will be very interesting to watch. And Maria Hallring of Ergo X2 is definitely at the cutting edge of this. She's really developed some fascinating stuff. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. If I could have the final slide, it's got some resources on it. So again, this will be replayed, so you'll be able to note those down. I know we've obviously overrun because we started so late, and I do apologize for the technology. I thought I'd done everything I could to prepare for it, but to no avail. But hopefully, Lisa, are you happy to have a few questions if anybody has any?
Yes, absolutely. People can either unmute themselves or...
Yeah, what do you make of the sort of adjustable saddles with the tree being able to take it out in the front to put it in the back, the fact that it's a V shape? I've heard it said that they generally just aren't that comfortable, that you're better off with an old-fashioned stable tree, which is more curved, whereas it's a V, basically. It's a V, and it potentially is not comfortable. Would you agree with that?
Well, you see, I fit my way. And the biggest thing I would ask you all to do is go and look at my blog, because I post some quite philosophical stuff in my blog. And there are so many different ways to fit a saddle. To me, they're much too, particularly, you know, there are certain brands. Some are slightly wider in the head being the pommel, so the top of the curve. Some are slightly wider than others. But if we don't take the saddle slightly out from the top, we can't get round the spinal processes in the wither. If everything is that shape, you have to lift the saddle incredibly high to not have some effect on pinching the spinal processes and the trapezius. And it tends to run backwards going into the rail shape we talked about. So if you have a very narrow head, it's more likely to have narrow or upright rails as well. They're plastic solid trees, which can be a little bit unforgiving, but under a heavy rider, very heavy riders, plastic trees, not great. You know, there are sturdy wooden trees. Some wooden trees are sturdier than others. When Alton Butler were around, they're not anymore, sadly, or they've been bought out. They might still be around as a brand. They were really solid trees, and we'd recommend them for heavier riders. So it depends on the rider as well. And then when we look at the philosophy of saddle fitting in the industry, the fact that they are changeable head plates, I think, can be quite dangerous. I think there are some people that are skillful enough to change them, but we talked about the interplay between clearance over the wither, and I will stress that, you know, if a saddle has lots of clearance at the front, that's not the same as it tipping back. A saddle can tip back with very little clearance at the front if it's completely the wrong shape. So these three things are very different: saddle balance, width, and wither clearance. They're related, but they're not the same. And it's very easy to go, oh, well, it's too high in front, I'll stick a wider head plate in. Or to go, it's too low in front, I'll stick a narrower one in. Or to look only at the tree width and ignore clearance. So I think they're a little bit dangerous and seen too much as DIY.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
Yeah. I have one. It's just proving not to be ideal at all. I have two of them actually.
Yeah. And wooden trees as well, I would say the cost of machine tooling on a plastic tree is huge. So to get a new plastic tree developed is a lot more expensive than a wooden tree. So they tend to so far have been quite generic in their shape. And you'll see, if you start to look at seat shapes on some of these websites, you'll see that all they're doing is putting a different panel on. They're keeping the tree the same, or they're adding a higher cantle. So, you know, often as not, they're trying to make them look like a different tree, and they're not. I mean, wider head. How can you have a wider head on one version of a saddle that's made with exactly the same shaped head plates as that saddle? That is bonkers, and I have no idea where that comes from. Forgive me not naming the brand, but it's a very big brand, and it says that some of its models have a wider head. Which
okay, and what letter does it start with, the brand?
Yeah, you're not suckering me into that one. No. Forgive me, you know, I'm a thorn in a lot of saddle makers' sides. I've had the owner of one of the big saddle companies contact me years ago, having a real pop at me for something I'd said that was negative about his brand. Okay, I just smiled and thought, if you don't have anything better to do than come after a little one-man band saddle fitter, then it's quite sad. Anyway, any other questions?
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. I follow various different people, you know, things pop up on Facebook, and like my thing always is, I know what I know, which is the behavior stuff. And I know enough about that to know when people don't know what they're doing about that. But when it comes to stuff that's not my area, it's much harder to be discerning because I don't know enough about it. But yeah, I was interested in what you said about the point straps, because there was one particular person was posting a lot about how you mustn't use the point strap. And I was just interested to know what is the correct kind of thing about that.
So it's up there with never use a thick pad under a well-fitting saddle. You know, okay. It's one of those. There are just so few blanket rules in saddle fitting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you about two things. So this saddle, if I fit this perfectly at the front with the right amount of flocking, the right width, and you can see this is a wide head on this saddle. Okay, this is for wide horses. So if I fit this perfectly in front, and the horse has a forward girth groove, and the saddle has to be placed behind the girth groove, you know, forget a vertical girth.
Yeah.
Hardly ever going to happen. Girths tend to angle forwards very slightly on most horses. So I am going to choose the point strap to drop the girth into the girth groove. So
point strap being the front one, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's literally attached to the tree point where I tapped that solid tree point earlier in the presentation. Yeah, it is literally sewn onto that. Stapled onto it, tacked onto it, depending on the construction. So it's attached directly to the tree point. Now, if you go fitting a saddle that is not as completely stable front to back. The fit at the front is slightly less than perfect, perhaps when you've gone out to adjust a saddle and you can't quite get it right. Or if otherwise you're fighting the balance of a saddle, if the front of the saddle keeps dropping, the worst thing you can do is put it on the point strap. If I'm fitting a tubey Connemara with narrow shoulders, please go and do some postural groundwork and those shoulders will widen, and a big dropped belly, please go and do some postural groundwork, then the rib cage will actually get slightly narrower and will come up and the girth groove will be less pronounced, as it is if they lose weight. But with a forward girth groove on a tubey shaped pony, you're going to find very few solutions that don't involve a point strap.
Yeah.
I've used straight girths for years. And, you know, I have horses develop amazing muscle under saddle. So point straps on their own can be fine. It depends.
Yeah, so you just need to know how you're using it then, which is why we have saddle fitters.
How's the saddle designed? How is it fitted? What does your fitter believe? What pad do you have underneath it? Is it a temporary thing? You know, sometimes we use a point strap. Some of the time, I often, on my fitting sheets, when I go out and do a saddle check, I have a box saying what your girthing is, which girth straps you select, because it's not the standard 3 in the middle.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, seeing as we're on the question or the questions of girth straps, I had heard that if your saddle slips to one side, you put the girth on, say 1 and 2 on one side and 2 and 3 on the other side. Have you heard of that?
So yes, asymmetric girthing can be very useful. I would rather get horse and rider straight, but you know, when you're fitting the entire market, you're not going to have everybody able to get that level of straightness, and that's why I fit different types of saddles as well. So I think I mentioned my girthing information sheet earlier. That gets right into that and explains where you've got 4 girth straps. So the front one is the point strap. So let me just show you again. So we have point strap floating about here. You can see that's literally attached to the tree point. We have 2 neutral ones in the middle, and this is the balance strap at the back. This is to balance, to me, laterally the back of the saddle. But they do have an effect. If the fit is not completely flat and stable, then they will pull down the front and back of the saddle. But it's this lateral pull that is important. You'll have a base girthing. So for your tubey connie, your base girthing will probably be that point strap and the third. Hardly ever 1 and 2, they're too close together. You're not going to actually be able to stabilize the saddle properly. So it's normally 1 and 3. So that's your base girthing. But if you've got a big wide cob, it might be 1 and 4. If you have a horse with muscle loss, it might be 2 and 3. I mean, these are very sweeping kind of, you know, statements. So please don't take these as gospel. But they might be typical base girth setups. Then you look at the asymmetry. And obviously, if you can't get rid of the asymmetry any other way, you may look at shimming. That might be preferable. The odd horse doesn't like asymmetric girthing. And I'm also very aware that as we get further back on the rib cage, particularly on the right, you know, if a horse has been a tiny bit ulcery, if we've got sugary grass, if we've got sensitivities or anything else going on with the rib cage, the odd horse doesn't like it. But yes, what we would do is wider girthing on the side that the saddle slips away from. So on a connie, my first port of call, if a saddle is slipping to the right, which is most common in my opinion, in my experience, then I would girth wider on the left, narrower on the right. So that would be 1 and 3 on the right, 1 and 4 on the left. Going to 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, where you've only got 3 girth straps in the middle, is probably not going to do anything. You really need the wider space girth straps to do it. And going straight to 1 and 3, 2 and 4, that would pull it to the right. That way around would be, actually, you've probably got me reversed. But yeah, 1 and 3 and 2 and 4 is not what I would go to first, because I'm losing the benefit of my base girthing. I've changed both sides. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Oh, and if you're going to go to wider part girthing, then you need a decent split in the girth. If you have buckles right next to each other with no no extensions, that's going to really not be very effective. Any other questions? Or have we dropped? I can't see anybody or hear anybody.
No, still
Yeah,
think.
you were saying you're happy with your straight girths yourself. You've used them for years because there's just so many wacky ones out in the market now. There's the free space one, there's the elbow room one, there's the one for fat ponies that is kind of half moon shaped.
So there are lots of girths. I think some are designed better than others. I don't use loads of them. I recommend a very shallow W-shaped girth, so with elbow shaping on the front and a very slight curve towards the front, but slight. It's the Harry Dabbs waffle girth. I really like it with strong elastic both ends, so it's a reasonably budget girth. The WOW girths, I think, have got quite a lot of merit. I've never needed to use an H girth, which people always talk about for stopping saddles slipping forwards. The free space girth is very interesting. Some horses love it, and it relieves pressure on the side of the rib cage. So they're all very specific. So it's understanding what you're facing with your horse, and bearing in mind that if you look at Sharon May Davies and her dissections, every single ridden horse had damaged elbows. So we're not getting girthing necessarily right, but equally, I think that damage comes more so from the rib cage being dropped through the elbows. If you get girth rubs, a lot of people will go straight to getting a big sheepskin, fluffy thing. But bear in mind that if your horse is slightly collapsed in the thoracic sling, then there will be very little space. If the horse is here, there'll be very little space this way between rib cage and elbow. And if you start trying to put a big fluffy girth there with the elbow trying to come backwards and forwards, then you might even make it worse. So it's look at the setup, look at the space, look at the movement, because I think a lot of us can see these things if we really sit and look and feel. That the obvious solutions aren't always the right ones. Now, I can take another question or two, but I know we're seriously overrunning, so I'm quite happy to wrap up if nobody else has got any other questions.
No, well, thank you so much. I'll put your details on the group as well, Steph. So if anybody wants to get in contact with you, wants to know anything more, we'll put that up on the group. And sure, if anybody...
and am I still on?
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm still on. My website has everything on it pretty much. So, the areas I cover, my prices, all of that, they're all on there. You wouldn't believe the number of messages. 90% of messages I get are information that's on my website, and a lot of it's on my Facebook page as well. So it's all there, but happy to answer questions if anybody wants to contact me. Yeah,
super job. And sure, if anybody has any questions, either go straight to Steph, or you can go through the group or via me or whatever. And thank you again. At least we managed to get it sorted.